Her name became a synonym for sin. She is remembered as the woman who destroyed a kinga, witch, a harlot, an idolater. But behind the religious rhetoric lies another story, the story of a queen who refused to submit. She was not an Israelite. Her marriage was political. Her faith was foreign. But she did not remain silent. She spoke, she influenced, she ruled, and for that she was cursed. Her enemy was a prophet. Her death was brutal. Her body devoured by dogs. But no one asks what if she simply refused to fade into the background in a house filled with prophets, kings, and conspiracies. She was the only woman whose name was feared for generations. This is not a story about sin. It is a story about power, and this is who. She was Jezebel. Jezebel was not born into obscurity. She was the daughter of a king, raised in the high stone palaces of Sidon, where incense burned constantly and every hallway whispered with politics. From her earliest memories, she understood that the world did not protect women, it tested them. But she had not grown timid in its presence. She learned to walk with poise, to speak with deliberation, to listen twice before answering once. Her education was not simply one of poetry and etiquette, but of diplomacy, theology, and court dynamics. She learned how kingdoms were shaped with swords alone, but with influence, reputation, and the careful manipulation of fear and loyalty. She had grown up watching her father rule with both devotion to their gods and absolute authority over his court. In that world, religion was inseparable from governance, and a queen was not just a wife, she was a presence, a counselor, a force. Jezebel internalized that truth early. There was no distinction in her upbringing between male ambition and female ambition. She was expected to understand trade routes and treaties just as thoroughly as she was expected to carry herself with regal bearing. And when she reached the age of marriage, she did not enter the negotiations with dreams of love or romance. She was well aware that she would be given, not chosen. And so when the news came that she was to be wed to Ahab, king of Israel, she did not cry or resist. She calculated. Her journey from Sidon to Samaria was not merely a relocation, it was a transition from a world where her gods reigned to a world where her very name was an affront. She knew what she represented. The alliance between her father's kingdom and Ahab's was strategic. Sidon had ports and trade power. Israel had land and military strength. But while her marriage was written in scrolls as treaty, her presence was viewed by the people as intrusion. She entered a land fragmented by civil unrest, led by tribes who barely agreed on who should rule them, and prophets who were more feared than monarchs. The God of Israel was jealous, the priesthood loud, and Jezebel's arrival, cloaked in the scent of foreign oils and Phoenician silk, was a symbol that something impure had entered the holy soil. From the moment she stepped into the court of Samaria, she was watched. Not with reverence, but with suspicion. She saw it in the way the women stiffened when she passed. She heard it in the measured silences that followed her steps. She smelled it in the fear that hung in the corridors. Like smoke, fear, not of war or famine, but of her. They feared her beauty, her confidence, her unfamiliar gods. They feared her presence because she carried herself like someone who did not believe she needed their approval. Jezebel did not try to conform. She wore her traditions like armor. She prayed to her gods, upheld her rights, and sat beside Ahab. as a queen who expected to be treated as one. But power in Israel was different. It was fractured and volatile, built less on the stability of heritage and more on the unpredictable tempers of prophets who claimed divine authority. Jezebel watched this with a diplomat's caution. She understood that Ahab, though king in name, often deferred to these voices. His strength as a warrior did not translate into moral confidence. He wavered, he hesitated, he listened to those who shouted loudest, especially when those voices claimed they spoke for God. Still, she stood beside him, smiling when expected, nodding when appropriate, but never surrendering her core. She hosted foreign dignitaries with flawless poise. She restructured the palace gardens to reflect the beauty of her homeland. She brought her priests not in secret, but in daylight, placing altars to Baal and Asherah in full view, not as rebellion, but as assertion. This, to her, was normalcy, integration, mutual power. She did not understand how deeply this would be perceived as threat, because in Israel, women were expected to be background, supportive, quiet, holy in the way silence is holy. But Jezebel was none of those things. She did not bow her head when spoken to. She asked questions. She disagreed. She advised. And she was right. That made it worse. She did not intend to wage war against the culture. She did not set out to become a villain. She wanted only to be treated with the dignity she had always been afforded. But in a land where authority was measured by how closely one followed a single God's command, Jezebel's strength was not admired, was criminalized. The very traits that had made her a jewel in Sidon now marked her as dangerous in Israel. Her intelligence became manipulation. Her became rebellion. Her heritage became heresy. And so they began to talk, whisper first, then louder. They called her name with venom. They painted her as seductress, corrupter, a foreign stain on a chosen people. Even as she fulfilled her duties, advising the king, maintaining the court, raising her children, they twisted her presence into narrative. They did not see a queen. They saw a threat wrapped in gold. She began to see it too, not in herself, but in them. In the way servants avoided her eyes, in the way advisors spoke more to Ahab's back than to his face when she was in the room, in the way the prophets stared through her as if she were already condemned. She was no longer simply foreign, she was feared, and she understood then her power would never be tolerated. It would be watched, measured, plotted against. It would be the excuse for everything that followed. But Jezebel did not yield. She did not apologize. She did not shrink. She had not been born to be tolerated. She had been born to rule. And if this land would not understand that, then it would learn. The first cracks appeared quietly, not in the structure of the palace, not in the fabric of her marriage, but in the glances exchanged between men who thought themselves righteous. Jezebel saw it in the way the court began to shift perceptibly at first, but then more boldly. The high priests of Israel, those who claimed communion with a singular God, began to speak of purification, not of the city's streets or of the nation's laws, but of its people, of its leadership, of its queen. The word foreign turned acidic in their mouths, and with it, every aspect of Jezebel's presence began to be recast as corruption. She had once thought herself safe behind the protections of diplomacy and royal alliance. She was, after all, a queen consort. She had married into the nation, bore the children of its king, supported his rule. But she had overestimated the security of position in a culture where power was only ever considered legitimate if it bowed to one god, one prophet, one interpretation. Jezebel bowed to none of those. Her faith was older than Israel's soil. Her god's Baal Asherah had been worshipped long before the patriarchs wandered the desert. In Phoenicia, gods did not demand singularity. They coexisted, negotiated, revealed themselves in fertility, rain, and grain. Jezebel saw no danger in their worship. To her, allowing room for multiple voices was wisdom. But in Israel, her gods were not seen as additional, they were seen as abomination. And so the opposition began to rise, not in swords, but in scrolls. Elijah, the prophet, whose voice carried thunder and whose prayers called drought, began to preach not simply of justice, but of vengeance. He spoke of Jezebel not by name, but by implication, a woman of influence, of foreign gods, of dangerous beauty. The people listened, the king wavered. Jezebel watched. She had expected resistance, but she had not anticipated the fury of a man who believed God himself stood behind every word he uttered. Elijah was not a politician. He was a storm wrapped in fire, and he wanted her gone. The drought came like a punishment, and the people suffered. They cried out, not to Baal or Asherah, but to the God of Abraham. The priests of Israel seized the moment, using suffering as evidence. They blamed her gods. They blamed her influence. They blamed her. Jezebel offered grain from the palace stores. She provided for the poor, but her acts of mercy were twisted into manipulation. Her compassion was cast as control. The people no longer cared for the truth. They wanted a scapegoat. Then came Mount Carmel. Jezebel did not attend the confrontation. She was not invited. The event was orchestrated by Elijah, by the court, by the priests who wanted blood. 450 prophets of Baal, her prophets, were summoned. They danced, they cried, they pleaded for fire. Elijah stood alone and mocked them. And when the fire finally came down on his altar, it did so with the timing of a performance meant to be remembered. Jezebel did not deny that it happened. She denied only the interpretation, but interpretation did not matter. Power did. When the slaughter began, it was not strategic, it was symbolic. It was a message. They were not just removing prophets, they were erasing her, her voice, her belief, her legacy. The men she had protected, funded, and trusted were cut down in the valley. Their blood soaked into the ground as the people cheered. And when the news reached her how they had died, how they had been mocked, something inside her burned hotter than grief. It was not sorrow, it was betrayal. Ahab said nothing. He had stood by as her world was dismantled. He had watched the massacre and returned to her chambers without shame, expecting comfort or silence or submission. Jezebel gave him none of those. She had loved him, perhaps not in the way songs are written, but in the way loyalty grows through shared rule and survival. But now she saw that he was not her ally, he was her weakness. He had chosen fear over her. He had chosen their enemies, approval over her voice. And Jezebel, for all her strength, had built her world around the illusion that his crown would protect her. She had no illusions now in the days that followed. Jezebel did not cry. She did not weep in public or wear sackcloth. Her mourning was sharper than that. It was a stillness that settled into the palace like a shadow, palpable, thick, unmistakable. She painted her eyes with more precision. she walked the corridors with the grace of someone preparing for something unspeakable. People stepped aside when she passed. Servants lowered their heads. Even the officials who had once whispered against her now watched her with quiet fear. They had seen what she was when she was loved. Now they would see what she became when she was betrayed. But she did not lash out. Not yet. Jezebel understood timing. She understood that revenge gained power only when it was patient. She rebuilt her court, restructured her alliances, began to communicate with foreign envoys. She revived her own priesthood in secret, not to incite, but to remember, to resist erasure. She began to catalogue the names of those who had cheered the loudest. She smiled in council meetings. She kissed her children's foreheads each night. But beneath it all, she crafted her response. Her enemies had tried to strip her of legitimacy by murdering what she had built. They believed they had made her smaller, but in truth, they had set her free. She no longer needed to defend her right to exist. Now she would make them justify their right to rule. The rules had changed. They had written her into a war, and Jezebel never lost a war she saw coming. The betrayal had not broken her. It had refined her. It had burned away the diplomacy, the assumption of shared loyalty, the remnants of alliance that had softened her gaze. Now she was not Jezebel, the queen consort. She was Jezebel, the power behind the throne. The strategist whose wrath was quiet but consuming. The prophets would speak her name with venom, but they would never forget it. That, at least, she would ensure the palace had grown quieter in the aftermath of blood. Jezebel could feel it in the stone beneath her feet, in the way voices now dropped when she entered a room, in the way even the bolder members of the court chose their words more carefully. The air hung with something different, now less tension, more calculation. Fear was no longer abstract. It had shape, scent, memory. The massacre of the prophets had shifted something permanent in Jezebel's world, but not in the way her enemies had intended. Their intention had been to break her publicly, spiritually, and permanently. Instead, they had carved away her illusions. And from that hollow, she began to build something else. She moved differently now, slower, not from caution, but from precision. There was power in control, in silence, in resisting the bait of retaliation. Jezebel understood that the court, the people, even her enemies, were waiting for her to lash out. They expected a woman undone, a queen wounded, desperate to assert herself. But Jezebel gave them nothing. She offered no outburst, no declaration of vengeance. Instead, she returned to her routines, wrapped in silk and subtlety. She prayed at her altars with the same reverence as before, eyes lifted to a heaven that no longer seemed so far. She walked through her chambers like a ghost wearing fleshknot, dead, but no longer fully tethered to the world that had once made sense. Inside, however, the transformation was total. She was no longer the same woman who had entered Israel as a bride, proud and diplomatic. She was no longer the wife who believed that the king beside her would protect her name, her faith, her children. That woman had been buried alongside the prophets. What rose in her place was sharper, colder, more enduring. Jezebel did not mourn in the ways others expected. She mourned through strategy, through resilience, through survival. If they would not allow her to be a queen in peace, then she would be a queen in war, quiet, methodical, relentless. Every morning, she watched the city from her balcony. Her eyes followed the rhythms of the people, the merchants who passed through the gates, the temple priests who sang louder now, emboldened by Elijah's triumph. She watched them not with hate, but with the kind of clarity born only from betrayal. These were not her people. They never had been. She had been sent here as an offering, a bridge between kingdoms, but the bridge had been burned and the offering rejected. Still, she remained. They had failed to erase her, and that meant she still had time. Within the palace, she reasserted control, not through decrees, but through presence. She visited the kitchens, the scribes, the storerooms. She ensured loyalty in places the prophets never thought to look. Ahab, for all his strength on the battlefield, had grown increasingly fragile in the court. Jezebel saw how he avoided the corridors where the prophets had once gathered. She noticed the way he flinched at Elijah's name, how he deferred to spiritual advisors who used their prayers as swords. He had become a figurehead, a king haunted by guilt he would never name aloud. And Jezebel, watching from behind veils and council doors, understood something devastating. She was now the only real center of power in the palace. She did not celebrate it, she grieved it. Power taken through force or fear was not satisfying. It was exhausting, but she held it because she had no choice. Her children were growing, their futures were in question. She could no longer count on Ahab to build a lasting dynasty. If legacy was to survive, she would have to be its architect. Began cultivating alliances, not with generals, but with their wives, not with priests, but with the scribes who copied the law. She listened in every room, remembered every name. She spoke only when necessary, and when she did, her words landed with finality. There were no more soft smiles, no more gestures of peace. Jezebel became an institution unto herself, present so constant that removing her would feel like tearing the very foundation from beneath the throne. But she did not feel powerful. She felt hollow. The silence around her was not reverence, it was warning. At night, she could not sleep. She walked the palace halls long after the lamps had been extinguished, her feet bare, the stone cold beneath her. She pressed her fingers to the carved walls and remembered Sidon's salt air, its open courtyards, the sound of priests who had called her name not with suspicion, but with honor. That world was gone, and yet she carried it in her. There were nights when she returned to her private chambers and lit the old incense, letting the smoke drift through her fingers like memory. She whispered prayers she no longer fully believed, not because the gods had changed, but because she had. Faith had once been a comfort. Now it was a discipline, a reminder of where she came from, of who she had been before her name became a warning. Jezebel did not stop believing, but belief had become less about gods and more about purpose. She no longer prayed for favor, she prayed for clarity, for resolve, for strength. She watched her sons closely, teaching them not with tenderness, but with truth. She told them of their bloodline, of their duty. She told them that the world would not love them, that they would be tested, that they would be called names not because of who they were, but because of what she was, and that they must never apologize for her, because she would never apologize for herself. In the silence of the court, Jezebel endured, not as a ghost, not as a villain, but as a woman who refused to vanish. Her story had been hijacked before it was written, but as long as she breathed, as long as her voice could echo through the chambers that once tried to silence her, She would resist being made into a symbol she did not choose. She did not need to speak to be heard. Her silence had become its own kind of roar, a warning, a prophecy, a quiet, unyielding refusal to disappear. The palace, though still standing, had become a battleground of appearances. In the courtyards, priests and prophets walked with renewed boldness, emboldened by Elijah's triumph and Ahab's passivity. The once vibrant tapestries from Sidon now hung dulled by dust and sun, ignored by those who considered them relics of a foreign queen's intrusion. Jezebel, however, was not distracted by fading fabrics. She was counting steps, watching movements, listening to conversations that were not meant for her. She no longer waited for acceptance. She had stopped asking for recognition. Instead, she began laying the stones of something colder, something more deliberate, not revenge, not yet, but architecture. The construction of a plan so exact that it would be impossible to undo once it had begun. She had learned by now that Israel's courts did not operate on reason. They responded to myth, to fear, to declarations delivered with divine certainty. Jezebel's clarity did not come with thunder, only logic, and it was logic that led her to a man named Naboth, a vineyard owner whose land bordered the palace grounds. The vineyard itself was small, but its location was strategic. Ahab, in one of his melancholic states, had gazed upon it with longing. He wanted it, not for war or wealth, but for comfort. He desired it as a private garden, something peaceful, personal. But Naboth refused. He cited law, inheritance, divine mandate. His words were measured, respectful, but firm. And to Ahab, already weakened by guilt and religious doubt, the refusal struck like humiliation. Jezebel, observing from the shadows of the throne room, understood that this was not just about property. It was about precedent. If the king could be denied, others might follow. If a man's private conscience could outweigh royal authority, then Jezebel's power already eroded would collapse entirely. This was not about land. It was about order, about survival, about what would be remembered. Ahab, true to form, retreated into sorrow. He fasted, he complained. He lay in bed like a child denied a toy. Jezebel did not scold him. She did not offer comfort. Instead, she went to her chambers, opened the old box of parchment and seal, and began to write. The letters she penned were not impulsive. They were precise, legal, irreversible. She invoked the name of the king, but the tone was hers. Naboth was to be accused of blasphemy both against God and king. Witnesses would be arranged. The trial would be swift. The sentence would be death. She did not feel joy as she wrote. There was no satisfaction in the ink, only resolve. She did not see Naboth as a man, but as a fracture in the structure she was determined to preserve. And fractures, if left unchecked, destroyed empires. The letters were delivered. The accusations read aloud. The crowd stirred with familiar righteousness. Jezebel watched from a distance as Naboth was dragged from his vineyard, his fate already sealed. Stones were raised. Words were shouted. Justice, they called it. Purity. Order. What Jezebel saw was control secured. When the dust settled and the blood soaked into the earth, Ahab received word that the vineyard was his. He rose from his bed, confused at how easily the problem had been resolved. Jezebel said nothing. She let him believe in divine intervention. It didn't matter. He had the land. The court had its example. and Jezebel had ensured that the monarchy would not bend to private conscience again. But the silence that followed was not peace. The prophet returned this time not with fire, but with a curse. Elijah came to the vineyard and declared judgment, not just upon Ahab, but upon Jezebel. Her name was spoken with venom. Her death was prophesied in the language of dogs and blood. It was not enough for her to be defeated. She had to be desecrated. Her legacy had to be reduced to horror. She heard the words. She felt their weight, and yet she did not flinch. Jezebel understood the performance of prophecy. She knew that men like Elijah did not speak only for God, but for power. His words were as much political theater as divine revelation. She had played this game before, and she had survived worse. But what she could not ignore was the shift in Ahab. He believed the curse. It broke something in him that had never truly been whole. He repented publicly, tore his garments, wept in ash. He distanced himself from her not in body, but in spirit. And Jezebel knew that she was now truly alone. The plan had worked. The throne was safe, the authority restored. But the cost was growing. She felt it in the court's silence when she entered, in the way the palace women avoided her gaze, in the way her own children were spoken of as descendants of sin. Jezebel had protected the kingdom, but lost any chance of redemption. No one would remember the logic, only the outcome. She had acted as any male ruler would, but she would not be judged as a ruler. She would be judged as a woman, and women were not allowed to wield power without paying for it in flesh. Still, she did not retreat. She reinforced alliances. She increased security. She made plans for her sons' education, their succession. She would not allow prophecy to dictate history. Jezebel believed in something stronger than fate, memory, and she intended to shape it for as long as breath remained. In her, the day would come when her enemies would move against her. She knew this. She did not fear it. She prepared for it. With every step, every word, every calculated silence, she wrote her name into the stone of the palace. They could strip away her title. They could distort her story, but they would never forget it. She would ensure it. The end did not come suddenly. It unfolded with the slow inevitability of wrought beneath marble, with whispered conspiracies and careful steps that moved like dust through a neglected palace. Jezebel had lived long enough to sense when something had shifted beyond repair. Ahab was dead. His chariot, once the symbol of royal strength, had returned, stained with blood. Dogs had licked it clean. The irony was not lost on her. Elijah's prophecy had not waited for hurt, had already begun its descent through her lineage. The palace mourned in silence, not out of reverence for Ahab, but in anticipation of the next move. Jezebel stood in black, veiled, unmoved. Her grief was not for the man. It was for the power that was slipping from her hands, like sand through fingers made tired by decades of holding too tightly. The vacuum of power, after Ahab's death, should have been filled by one of their sons. Jezebel had prepared them for this. She had coached them in diplomacy, in survival, in the weight of a name that provoked more than it protected. But the kingdom was not waiting for sons of a queen they despised. Jehu was rising, a commander, once loyal to Ahab, now cloaked in divine justification, blessed by prophets, anointed not with oil but with fury. Jezebel heard the rumors of his march through Israel, of his decisive executions, of how each city he passed through offered no resistance, not because they loved him, but because they feared being associated with her. She had become the stain they sought to wash away. Her name alone was enough to inspire retreat. Her legacy had been reshaped so thoroughly by prophecy and repetition that no one dared question the story anymore. Jezebel was no longer a queen. She was a monster in the mouths of priests, a warning etched into scrolls. Still, she did not run. There was no plan to flee. She would meet the end as she had met every betrayal before it, standing, painted, unshaken. The palace walls trembled when Jehu approached Jezreel. She could feel it in the footsteps of servants, in the hollow quiet that fell over the hallways. Her advisors had vanished. The gates were unmanned. No defense was prepared. Her sons were dead. Her alliances disintegrated. But she still had her face, her voice, her final stage. She entered her chambers, opened the carved box of pigments, and applied the paint with careful grace, not as a mask, but as a declaration. Her enemies would not see her undone. They would not take her trembling. They would see her as she had always been, regal, composed, undefeated in posture. Even as the world collapsed around her. She stepped to the window, high above the courtyard. Below, Jehu entered the gates, his horse coated with dust and blood. He did not look up at first. He moved with purpose, with the authority of a man who believed he carried divine justice in his wake. But when he finally did raise his eyes to meet the tower, he saw her, painted, framed by stone, unafraid. There was no exchange of words, not the kind that mattered. Jehu issued orders. Jezebel watched as her own guards turned, as betrayal unfolded. Not with a sword, but with hands that had once served her. She did not scream, she did not beg. They seized her, dragged her to the ledge, and threw her down. The fall was not long, but the impact echoed. Her body struck the stones below, shattering not just bone, but memory. Blood pooled quickly, and Jehu, without ceremony, entered the palace. He ate, he drank, he dismissed her body as waste. Dogs came. The prophecy completed itself in the grotesque logic of men who call violence divine. By the time someone thought to bury her, there was almost nothing left. But a body is not a legacy. Jezebel had been stripped of burial, of mourning, of dignity. Her name had become synonymous with evil, her death reduced to a moral point in a prophet's story. But history, even when written by the victors, cannot silence presence. Jezebel had shaped a kingdom. She had ruled when women were meant to be silent. She had spoken when obedience was demanded. She had worshipped differently, led fiercely, and refused to disappear even as every force around her conspired to erase her. Her death was a spectacle, but it was not a defeat, because Jezebel did not die small. She died seen. And that was the truest threat of all. They did not bury her. They did not eulogize her. They did not remember her as a queen. Jezebel, once seated beside a king, once draped in silks and surrounded by the weight of empire, was reduced in death to a myth wrapped in warning. Her body, torn and discarded, became the final punctuation in a story written not by her, but by those who had always feared her. But stories are not static, and history, though recorded by the victors, often fails to bury the truth it tries so desperately to suppress. Jezebel's name endured, not with affection, not with honor, but with venom. She became the archetype of the dangerous woman, the seductress, the witch, the usurper, the godless queen. Her painted eyes and bold words were remembered not as symbols of courage or identity, but as marks of corruption. Her refusal to kneel became, in the mouths of her enemies, evidence of wickedness. Her power was repackaged as manipulation, her strength rewritten as sin. But beneath the layers of accusation, behind the prophetic rage and righteous condemnations, a different story remains, waiting to be seen. Jezebel was not evil. Jezebel was inconvenient. She was not deviant. She was disruptive. In a world where women were meant to be submissive, silent, invisible, except as vessels for men's legacy, she carved out a place, not by permission, but by insistence. She stood in temples, in courts, in towers, unashamed of her origin, her worship, her mind, and for that she became the enemy. No one tells the story of how she led, how she protected the monarchy during Ahab's weakest years, how she raised sons to rule, negotiated foreign policy, maintained order in a fracturing kingdom. No one speaks of the cultural violence she endured daily, walking through corridors where her gods were mocked, her prayers dismissed, her presence tolerated only until it threatened to influence. They do not speak of the duplicity she faced expected to serve a throne that never accepted her, expected to inspire loyalty while enduring constant suspicion. Her actions were not always gentle, but neither were the actions of the men who ruled beside her. Unlike them, however, she was offered no complexity. She was denied nuance. David could murder and still be a man after God's own heart. Solomon could wed foreign wives and remain the wisest king. But Jezebel could not speak without condemnation, could not govern without being labeled evil, could not mourn, act, or plan without prophecy rising against her, and yet she acted anyway. The image of her painting her face before death is often weaponized to suggest vanity or defiance, but it was something deeper than that. It was sovereignty. She faced the end, not as a victim, but as herself. She did not disguise her identity. She embodied it, fully, publicly, fearlessly. She knew that she would be killed. She knew that the dogs would come. But she also knew that those final moments mattered. She would not die crawling. She would not die diminished. She would die as she had lived, visible, unapologetic, in command. Centuries later, her name would still provoke. Her story would be told in sermons, twisted into a cautionary tale for women who dared too much, felt too deeply, ruled too boldly. But there would also be those who looked again, who asked what had been hidden beneath the hatred, who questioned the authors of the narrative, who understood that power, when worn by a woman who refuses to bend, has always been mistaken for sin. Jezebel's story was never just about gods or kings. It was about the price of being a woman who would not apologize for existing at full scale. It was about the terror she evoked in a system built to keep her kind quiet. And though her body was left unburied, her memory was never laid to rest. It lingered in fear, in whispers, in warnings. But perhaps that was her final act of power, to become unforgettable. She was not the villain they described, nor the saint they could never allow. She was something far more dangerous, a woman with power, a mind that would not yield, and a will that outlived every prophet who tried to curse her name. In the end, they wrote her story, but they could not erase her presence. Not truly. She was Jezebel, and she remained